So, welcome to this episode of the HRD Talks podcast, where we talk with HR directors and people directors about their journey into HR. We get their insight into current trends in the world of work and take their advice on the future of HR and how HR professionals can deliver value and progress their career. I'm Nick Elliott, employment lawyer. Today, I'm super excited to welcome Nimira Kassam, who is the People Services Director at PPL PRS.
Thanks for having me, Nick.
No problem at all. So, we've got a lot to talk about. I'm excited about it. We've known each other quite a while, so there's plenty of ground to cover. And I'm really excited about having you on the podcast. Let's start with how you got into HR. So how did your career start?
So I initially, when I went to university, started out in accounting and finance, believe it or not. After the first semester, realised it absolutely wasn't for me. So wasn't sure what to do. Spoke to a few lecturers and said, I can't continue with this course. Not enjoying it at all. Cannot imagine myself seeing the 3 years through. So a couple of lecturers recommended marketing, others recommended HR. Decided to give HR a go. Absolutely loved my degree. It was the right decision. Got to the end of the 3 years in academia, but actually, like a lot of individuals, really struggled to get a role in HR. I had no practical experience, no application. So initially, just to get my career kick-started, took a role in banking. Did a couple of years, got some really good transferable skills, and then all of my career, as you'll see as we progress the conversation, is East Midlands based. So the brand that I was working for at the time was actually Nottingham Building Society. They had a junior role in HR come up as a HR assistant. So I decided to plough absolutely everything into getting this role. I needed to secure it and I needed somebody to give me that first chance. Luckily for me, I did secure the role. Had a great career with Nottingham Building Society, learned some amazing best practice, really good footing into HR as well. They at the time were heavily unionised, so I got some exposure to some great projects. So during my time there, I watched the HR director consult with the union on the closure of the final salary pension scheme. So as a junior HR person, although a lot of people would see minuting meetings as quite a boring kind of part of the role, I absolutely just enjoyed it. I took everything in my stride. Sat through disciplinary, sat through some grievance hearings, got involved in recruitment. So got some really good generalist experience that I do think set me up for my career. So I kind of fell into HR through avoidance of accounting and finance.
Sorry, finance people.
My partner is actually a head of finance. So
Yeah, and where next?
So from there, I was at a wedding. I didn't realise I was actually being interviewed by one of the guests that I was sat near. So she was asking me about my career. I was telling her what I was doing, and she invited me to, the following week, invited me to come and work for them on a temporary basis to help set up their HR function. They were facing some people challenges, and I was quite happy where I was, but actually decided to give it a go.
Okay.
So I moved into the education sector initially, did a couple of years there. And then more importantly, moved into a role at TDX Group. So it's a local Nottingham-based firm. They help companies with debt collection through technology, a very fast-paced organisation that's now American-owned. So I think it was at TDX Group where my career really started to change and take shape. So I got involved in a lot more projects, delivery, launched some leadership and development programs. We started I got my first foot in the door with some acquisitions. How do you really start to integrate businesses on the back of acquisitions? So I think TDX Group was a temporary role to set up the function, but actually within about 3 or 4 weeks, I was made permanent. So stayed there much longer than planned. Met some great people. The business was very commercially focused as well. So got some good experience. So moved from banking into the education sector, then through to TDX Group, and then decided to stay in tech because I really enjoyed the tech side of things. So after an 18-month stint at TDX Group, I was invited to become a HR manager at a very small tech startup called Colstream. It's short for Collection Stream, Derby-based business. And what attracted me there was TDX Group had grown to a point where the HR team was growing, the business was growing. So you were no longer generalist and getting involved in everything. Actually, the team were really starting to specialise. And I missed certain stakeholders, I missed certain projects and getting involved in things. So the role at a much smaller company and at a slightly more senior level is kind of what drove me to Colstream.
Yeah. And what size was that at that stage?
At that point, it was actually only 30 employees.
Okay.
So moving from a fairly big company that I think TDX was maybe about 250 people at the time and had a small international presence to a company of 30 that was founder-led was a huge culture shock. But actually, it was the right decision. I got involved. Within about a year of joining Coldstream, it got acquired by Ascendex, which is now known as Comify Group. So Comify is a huge player in the market. It's headquartered in Nottingham and has got a big international presence. So being acquired within a year did make me think, what next? Didn't realise I'd stay there for the next 9 years. So I stayed with Comify just shy of 10 years. Had an amazing career there and learned so much. So during that period, probably we did maybe 13 or 14 acquisitions. We had a great M&A director that was very hungry, had so much knowledge in that space and really helped to grow the company. But I think from a HR perspective, I got involved in some interesting projects. So when you're doing acquisitions, actually in the UK, they can be fairly straightforward to some extent because at least you don't have challenges like language barriers. Whereas Comify was growing heavily in Europe. We were entering new territories, sometimes by organic growth and sometimes via acquisition. But by the end of Comify, I think there was nearly 400 employees. So it was transformational in terms of the development that I received from that company. And I think what really kind of helped me with my career was some great bosses, also working alongside some really fantastic board members. And I think all of which really believed in me. So the 10 years just absolutely blew me away in terms of my career. I couldn't have asked for a more exciting period of growth.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those that don't know, what did Comify do, or what do they do?
Good question.
Yeah.
That's where I should have started.
No, that's fine.
So Comify Group would help businesses with their communications. So they would build communication tools via technology. So in its simplest form, and actually it started out as SMS. So it could be a doctor's surgery sending you a text message to remind you of an appointment. And from there, it really grew its product portfolio, but all in the communication space. So it was brilliant.
Yeah.
Really, really good business.
And I guess towards the beginning of that journey, it's when you and I met and had the opportunity to work together. But seeing your career develop as the business developed has been fantastic. Talk a bit about that.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I think it all just happened. I think so. Very quickly, when Coldstream got acquired by Comify Group, we had a fantastic CEO that was very people-centric and actually asked me to, we were working in Derby, the head office was in Nottingham. He actually asked me to come and work in the Nottingham office, and I lived in Nottingham. So of course I said, yes, that's brilliant. Saves me a huge commute every day. And actually at that point, the company had been through a management buyout. It then became private equity backed. And I think the growth for the business really came from the private equity backing. So there was lots of investment in all areas. It wasn't just the technology that was invested in. It wasn't just, all areas of business development. Actually, the people side had a huge amount of investment as well, which did help. I introduced lots of benefits to the organization. And I think what was nice was you could come up with lots of new ideas, you could innovate, and actually the leadership team were really open to change. We then went through a second round of private equity and again, even more change. So I think it never really felt like sometimes you can say people stay with a company too long. It never really felt like I'd been there 10 years because every year the clock was reset. My team, when I joined, I hired the first employee, my HR assistant. And by the end of it, I had an L&D function. I looked after the office management team. I had an international HR team. So from a career development perspective, it felt like a very natural transition. And yeah, because there was so much growth, the clock was reset every year. When I hit my 5-year milestone, I remember the CEO at the time giving a presentation and about the value that HR was adding to the business and the great job we were doing. And I thought, wow, I've made it to 5 years with the business. And next thing you know, before I know it, I was approaching 10 years service. So I think the growth of the business is what just kept me there for so long. It was just such an exciting, interesting period of growth.
Just hearing you talk about that, it kind of, to me, emphasizes the real value in having a CEO who's people focused.
Absolutely.
Not everybody has that luxury.
Yeah, definitely.
But
definitely.
You've obviously benefited from that during that period.
Yeah, definitely. And I really appreciate those people that have supported me with my career. There's so many managers. I've been quite lucky. I've had a lot of people help me progress. I remember the call when the COO at the time, the Chief Operating Officer, rang me to promote me to Head of HR. And then a few years on from that, I was promoted into the executive leadership team and became HR director. So actually, and none of that was through it never came easy. It was a lot of hard work, a lot of time and commitment, but actually people believing in me. And at times, I would say probably believing in me more than I believed in myself. I would also say we had some great board members. There's certain people that really stand out in my career that have helped. They've invested time in me, they've developed me, they've supported me. And I think everybody needs that in their career. They need those champions around the table. So all I can ever do is be grateful to all of those people.
And I think you're also quite modest because you're certainly up there, if not the most hardworking HRD that I've ever had the pleasure to work with.
Thank you.
So there you go. Okay, so then Comify comes to an end and
Yes.
you're in a new chapter.
Yes.
What, nearly 2 years ago? 18 months, 2 years ago?
Yeah, it's been 18 months now at PPL PRS.
So explain what that business does.
Yes. So PPL PRS is a brand that not everyone has heard of. I hadn't until I was approached by an agency. So what we do is we provide music licensing to businesses. So we legally allow businesses to use music. And with the money that we make from the licensing, that's all paid out in royalties to artists. So it's a very different industry. And one of the trends you'll see through my background in career is, I've tried different sectors. I think to some extent, HR is HR wherever you go, although it just brings slightly different challenges. But for me, it was, I'd been in the tech space for nearly 15 years. So when this came about, I decided to go through the recruitment process. And actually, the more I progressed through the recruitment process, it really whetted my appetite. I met various members of the leadership team, got to understand the growth plans of the business and where it was in terms of its kind of growth plans. So yes, I have been here 18 months now. And
what kind of a business is it? What's the culture like? As the new HRD coming in, no doubt you're working on that too.
Yes.
Tell us a bit about that.
So it's a joint venture. We've only been going 7 years, so it's still relatively young in its kind of growth phases.
Yeah.
I think it's very, very people-centric, though. It's got a very inclusive business culture. We've got lots of employees that are well supported, and actually diversity is welcomed, which not a lot of businesses take seriously enough.
Yeah.
Whereas I do think here there's a genuine buy into how important that is. So yes, I would say a very inclusive culture, strong appetite for growth. And actually what really stands out is that people buy into the ethos of the company. So actually there's a lot of really talented musicians and artists that may be working in finance or maybe working in, the quality assurance team or even in our contact center. But actually the thing that pulls everybody together is the impact of music and actually protecting the future of music through, the importance of licensing.
That's interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And growth plans for the future, you've mentioned a couple of times.
Yes. So like I said, we're a joint venture. So we have two sets of shareholders, both with slightly different approaches. But actually, we're not in a phase where it's all about aggressive growth. They're very supportive around the fact, and they do appreciate that we're still quite a young company. So actually getting some of the foundations in place is really, really important. Not to say that growth isn't. So I think for us, we've developed a 3-year plan. And as part of that, it's a real balancing act. How do we get some of the foundations in place? And actually, how do we continue to grow during that? So for me, coming in, it was exciting. I had, in terms of people services, so my remit includes HR and payroll, internal communications, learning and development, and the office management team. So it's a very similar remit to my role at Comify. But I think the big difference really is we're UK based, whereas Comify was international. Now, I thought I'd miss some of the international side of things, but actually this role has kept me extremely busy. So when I joined, unfortunately, people services had lost quite a few people prior to me joining. So my first 12 months had to become very quickly, how do I hire my own team? I now can say after 18 months of being here, it's been hard work, but I have a fantastic team behind me. They really have helped to shape the people strategy. We've delivered some fantastic results in a short space of time. But I think in terms of what next, we have a really clearly defined 3-year plan. We know exactly what we want to deliver, but I think there's just so much good stuff to continue to get stuck into.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. You talked about diversity. You talked about that kind of people agenda more broadly. One of the challenges I think a lot of businesses have at the minute is attracting people, retaining people, looking after them well while they're here. How have you found that? The challenges in that area?
So one of the things that I did early on when I came, after my first couple of months of onboarding, just starting to get to know some of the gaps in the team, I could see a clear gap for talent acquisition. So we didn't have any in-house internal talent acquisition. And I felt like to really strengthen our employer brand, really focus on improving the employee experience or the candidate experience even prior to them becoming an employee, it was important to be hiring the right people to get that stable workforce. So we've now got an in-house talent acquisition individual. She's fantastic. She's very passionate about selling our brand. She's very passionate about making sure we get the right people in post. So I think we've done a lot of work in the talent acquisition space. There's still so much more to be done. But I think for us, making sure that every candidate that applies for a role with PPL PRS walks away thinking, do you know what? That's a fantastic brand and I really want to work for that company. So our selection process is kind of being enhanced. I think one of the challenges that we did face as a business was high attrition. So the company, the joint venture went live. We obviously, go live is a fairly big project. It's a huge project. Then we went through COVID, like all other businesses, which almost did stop that growth and that maturity for the business for a period of 18 months. So since then, and also we operate in a sales environment, our attrition was high at times. So we've worked really, really hard to drive down our attrition. When I joined, it was approximately 40%. Now that's quite normal for a sales environment, for a very young business that's still starting out really. What we've tried to do though, we know that impacts on our ability to deliver our strategy. So in 2023, we got it down to around 33%. So a big improvement there. And actually in 2024, year to date, it's tracking at just shy of 20%. So a huge amount of work has really gone into our employee life cycle. How do we improve our employee value proposition? How do we protect the culture as we grow? How do we keep these great people, but also ensure that the people joining as we grow are the right culture fit for us? So I would say it's definitely not an easy gig in terms of hiring and retaining all of those employees. We're in a very competitive space. We're surrounded by the contact centers. So we're always having to benchmark and make sure we're staying ahead of the game. There is so much more we can absolutely do.
And what about looking after people while they're here? I know that's super important to you as well.
Definitely. So I think for me, I genuinely believe what keeps an employee motivated, happy, and engaged is actually the manager in post. I genuinely think it's around transparency, it's around authentic leadership and being very genuine with your team. So one of the things we've done is heavily invest in our management team. All of our managers across the business are going through a 12-month management leadership development program. And a lot of them are very experienced managers. So it's not around teaching them how to do their jobs, but how do we take that to the next level of capability? How do we continue to enhance their skills? How do we build that peer-to-peer network for managers across the business? So for us, we're heavily investing in our people leaders, just because we've all had good and bad leaders along the way in our careers. And I think what makes you sticky with a business is having a fantastic leader that communicates well with you, that empathizes, that genuinely takes an interest in your career development and supports you.
Yeah.
So for me, the key ingredient really is the manager.
Yeah, no, agreed. And tell us a bit more about what you're doing with those managers. So what does that actually involve in terms of that management training?
Yes. So our senior learning and development manager is leading the program. It's an in-house program. And I think the beauty of having it in-house is that actually you can talk about a lot of real life challenges. So, you can talk in a safe space around examples that you're facing. You may have performance conversations, but actually instead of just focusing on a lot of the traditional HR topics, like how do you engage a team, difficult conversations, they're part of every leadership program. Yeah. We have modules around mental health and well-being. We have modules around diversity and inclusion because we really, really care about our culture. So for us, we are supplementing it with a couple of kind of specialist external speakers, but in the main, it's in-house. Now, as the sponsor, I'm also drifting in and out of the modules. It's really nice to hear some of the healthy conversations that are happening and also some of the challenges that managers are facing. So how do we learn from that as a people services function and continue to support? We've got 3 cohorts at the moment and it's a 12-month program. So it's a big time investment, but actually we are probably about a quarter into that. And so far, so good. We've had some really good feedback.
Yeah, that's great. And then we're kind of shifting a little bit. One of the things that I think is interesting about your time at Comify was the international side, and I appreciate PPL is keeping you busy just in the UK, which is fine. But you were doing acquisitions internationally. You were managing people, offices that you were setting up from scratch in other countries, and that all sounds very glamorous. But how was that? Part of the reason for raising it is, there will be HR people, across the UK who are having to manage those kind of situations, or are thinking, "Oh, I'm about to be asked to recruit in a new, jurisdiction or whatever it might be." And there's unique challenges, I think, aren't there, to those kind of exercises? Tell us how you approach that.
Yeah, really good question. So I think the international side, I think the employment law was probably one of the most challenging bits. So especially in a period of rapid change. So as an example, during COVID, understanding the furlough legislation, understanding how to change a business overnight in terms of its approach to people management, and actually how we were, who are we furloughing, who do we not, what's the tax implications, the payroll implications of that. That was challenging enough. Now, in some of our smaller territories, we didn't always have the luxury of having a HR individual. So we had UK-based employees trying to manage other territories where they didn't necessarily understand the employment law, and they had a big agenda already happening in the UK. So my advice would be get some really good trusted experts, get some really good employment lawyers or HR partners that can support you when you really need to make rapid decisions fast. But from an acquisitions perspective, I would say there's some, we did a lot of acquisitions at Comify. We initially focused on Europe, and then actually we started to venture out into the States, for example. And I think there's some really great things when you're acquiring a business, but actually it's a really sensitive time for employees. And I think you very quickly have to put your arms around the workforce, make those employees feel welcome into the family. But actually that's not always easy. One of the things that always stands out to me was an Italian acquisition that we did. So great business, really high growth, fantastic people that had been with the business a very, very long time. We did the acquisition. Lots of great growth done, EBITDA growth for us. But actually from a people perspective, one of the simplest things that drove so many challenges was the fact that the Italian team didn't speak English and the UK team didn't speak a word of Italian. So initially in board meetings, we had translators. Myself and the CEO went over to talk to the team. We had a translator in the room. Now that's not only time consuming, but it also makes it that little bit harder to build rapport with the team. We opened up a new office out in Ferrara in Italy. We went out to open the office. It was great. We toasted the office with the team. It was such a beautiful office and a really proud achievement. And actually the team there loved it because the office that they had prior to the acquisition wasn't great. So we made a huge investment in them, and it was a real kind of show of our commitment. But actually even in the presentation, the CEO had to be translated. So actually there are some really unique challenges. And I think every acquisition brings with it some very similar challenges around, how do you merge two different organizational designs? How do you compare from a benefits perspective? TUPE isn't the same in the UK as it is in other countries. But actually some of the softer side of it, really just the language barriers and things like that. And actually our unique language or our language across the business, our downloads, our town halls are all based in English. So actually we invested some of our training budget in upskilling the Italians to be able to speak English. Okay. So a very different challenge that we didn't think we'd come across. Some of our acquisitions, we didn't even need to think about language barriers, but actually that was quite a common thing. So yeah,
that's interesting. Okay, great. Thank you. The other thing that we talk about on the podcast quite often are kind of topical issues of the day.
Okay.
And kind of get your thinking on some of those. One of those that we'll not major on, but we've been talking about recently is the new legislation coming in the UK, so the Employment Rights Bill. Anything in that stands out for you in particular?
Yeah, I've been to a couple of roundtables recently, obviously, just to keep my hand in some of the changes that are coming and how we may need to adapt some of our processes. I think some of it is still a little bit vague, so I'm intrigued to see how it progresses.
Correct.
But I think there's a few bits that do stand out. I think the unfair dismissal rights, at the moment, for those of you that are aware, obviously it's a 2-year, you don't receive as an employee your employment rights for things like unfair dismissal until you hit 2 years service. Actually, that's moving to day one rights. From a personal perspective, I think 2 years is a very long time for an employee to wait to start to have some of that protection. But I think we're almost moving to an alternative extreme now of day one rights. That will have some positives and negatives. So from an employee perspective, actually, it makes it easier to move roles. But then at the same time, from an employer perspective, especially for smaller employers, I anticipate they're going to be a lot more nervous about hiring and making bad hiring decisions. So I think for those organizations that have HR functions, I think they've really got to support their managers to make sure we're making good hiring decisions. And I think one of the other things HR teams can do to support their managers is actually assessing the fit of an employee early on. We've been afforded the luxury of 2 years. If an employee isn't right for a business, you've got to nip it in the bud. Make that decision early and handle the situation before it becomes a bigger problem. Yeah. I think there's some other good elements to the bill, things like the family leave, bereavement leave, for example. Yep. I think that's a great addition. But I think some of it is still yet to be seen as it progresses.
Yeah, let's watch this space, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I guess one of the other common topics that come up at the minute in the world of HR is hybrid working, remote working, all that stuff, the mandate to return to the office for a lot of big employers and that kind of thing. How do you view that?
Yeah, and it's interesting because working at Comify, being in the technology sector and also a very large organisation, internationally based, you did have, after COVID, you had more and more of a remote workforce. Yep. And also you had the technical skills challenge as well and shortage. So you didn't always hire people local to the office. So actually the idea of kind of getting employees back into the office was really challenging. So actually we had to be a lot more looser in our approach and let employees do what works for them. And sometimes we did find that, you lose out on some of the real benefits of collaborative working. So for example, a new starter joining the business, you onboard so much more quickly if you're surrounded by people that are experts and can support you. What's really refreshing is PPL PRS, completely different industry and sector, and actually the expectation is set from the point that someone's hired that we operate hybrid working. Every employee is expected to be in the office a couple of days a week. And I think that's been great because you're giving the employee the flexibility where they need it. We don't mandate which days you're in the office. Most employees can pick that. But actually, having that physical presence, but also the flexibility balanced out is working quite well for us. And I really, as a people person, I would say I'm a bit more biased towards being around people than remote working. I think there is a place for remote working, but not 100% remote working. Yep. I think the cultural benefits are lost when you're kind of not celebrating success or learning from each other. And from a diversity and inclusion perspective, we do so much great stuff in the office. We try to be inclusive because we do have a field sales team that do work from home. And we also have a third party team in South Africa. We have to be mindful and not leave them out of things. But actually, I think there are lots of advantages of having hybrid working and an office presence. So I absolutely love the fact that we have people in 3 days a week. But I have been following the press and social media, and I can see lots of companies are kind of swinging from during COVID or on the back of COVID, 100% remote. And then now I think some companies have almost gone too far, saying you're now back in the office 5 days a week. Yep. That's too big a shift. And I think for their hiring process also hasn't kept up with that. So companies have hired people all over the UK. I'm aware of an employee, a friend of a family, that took a role based in London, but actually lives locally in the East Midlands. He took the role on the ethos that it was 100% remote. And now the company is forcing them back into the office 3 days a week. He's already on the jobs market. Yeah. So I'm kind of watching from a distance, but luckily we have the luxury here of we're not operating in a skill shortage area. We try and hire within a commutable distance. So we operate hybrid working as opposed to remote.
Yeah. And you've got a super cool, newly refurbished office that we sat in and recorded.
Exactly.
Which no doubt will also help.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Do you know as well, that was one of the things that really sold the brand to me. When I came in for interviews, seeing the PPL PRS offices, they are absolutely phenomenal. They're so great and allow a great working environment. So and we're trying to maintain them. So
that's great. So PPL PRS, plan for the year ahead, let's say next 12 months.
Okay.
From the people side.
Yeah, from the people side. So I would say we're really focused on organizational maturity. And what I mean by that is we've gone through, we've only been going for 7 years and we've had COVID in the middle of that. So for us, the next phase really is how do we become more agile? How do we become more efficient in our processes? We've spent a lot of time over the last 18 months, specifically in people services, focusing on the foundations, making sure we've got the right people in the right roles, able to support that people strategy. But from next year's perspective, I think an area that we can support the business better with is data. So we have a fantastic HR information system that's got all of the data inputs, but actually, are we using the outputs well enough? I don't think we are. We're building a dashboard, and that's really going to be able to give managers get to the essence of some of our people challenges. Actually, let's look at some data. We look at attrition at an organizational level. Let's start really pinpointing where are areas where we really need to focus. So I think providing managers and the workforce with better data is probably a massive area we can improve.
That's interesting. Anything else on the agenda?
There is a lot on the agenda for next year. What else is in there that could be interesting? So I would say we do a lot of great work in the D&I space. So we have affinity groups across the business that bring small teams together. So as an example, we have a religious allies group. So they do a lot of work in the raise awareness, educate the workforce. We celebrate certain festivals and things like that. One of the things that we're doing in terms of D&I is setting up a clear framework. So how do we actually set some clear goals and objectives? And actually specific to the music sector, we do gender pay gap reporting. From an ethnicity pay gap reporting, there is more work to be done. Does our workforce meet the demographic of the area that we're located in? So I think we're doing a lot more proactive work in the D&I space and really on the cultural side.
Sounds really good. Okay. One of the other things that we talk about on the podcast is advice to the HR profession. Okay. So I always like to push the HRDs to share their wisdom for those, I suppose, starting out in the career in HR. And you talked about kind of forcing your way into the building society to try and get that first role. And I think that is definitely a challenge for people, but also taking that step from sort of a head of to an HRD or people director or people service director, that kind of thing. What would you say on those two?
So for somebody early on in their career, I would probably say my advice would be a sponge, be an absolute sponge. Use the people around you, use your network. I think one of the things that stands out to me the most, where I probably learned so much, a lot of people would see minutings. When I said I joined, early on as a HR assistant, minuting a union meeting, minuting a disciplinary hearing, minuting a grievance, minuting a recruitment process. As a very junior member of staff, running your grievance or your disciplinary for the first time can be really daunting. But actually a safe space to be able to learn how others do that is by minuting. So I would say my advice would be minute as many meetings as you possibly can, just to get some really good exposure. But then for those that are maybe HR manager, head of HR, looking to step up into a more senior role, my advice is probably slightly different. So I would say, in order to be successful at the exec table, you've really got to partner with your exec team. Get under the skin of their challenges. How can you help them better? So I would say partnership with them. And second piece of advice would probably be credible and authentic. Now, from a credibility perspective, what I mean is to really get to know the business, understand the business. And then from an authentic perspective, unfortunately, in HR, you do have to sometimes deliver some bad news and some difficult messages. Stay true to your values and be authentic and genuine. Treat people how you would want to be treated. So I think it doesn't matter how senior you become, be authentic.
Yeah, and I think, again, my reflection of having observed you do your job for the time that you have, I think that's definitely one of your key values and one of your strengths. People thanking you at the end of very difficult processes, even because you treated them well. Yeah. And I think sometimes that gets missed, particularly in, high paced or there are some more difficult sectors, aren't there, out there? Yeah. But actually, like you say, your mantra of treat somebody how you would want to be treated goes a long way, doesn't it?
100%. I think you've got to empathise. If you're delivering a difficult message, don't turn up unprepared. Think about how that message is going to land. How are you going to support the employee through some of the change that may be coming? So yeah, absolutely. I would say be authentic and true to yourself right through.
Great. The other thing we have is something called the supplier shout out.
Okay.
Where we kind of, highlight another organisation that you've worked with, that supported you, that it's worth people checking out?
So that's a good question. We work with lots of great suppliers, and I have done throughout my career, I would say. But I think a local company that really stands out to me is the Art of Brilliance. So they are Derbyshire based. They have a team of consultants and positive psychologists. They deliver keynote talks, the workshops, facilitations, and they're so fantastic. It's high impact training. And actually, there's a lot of behavioural change on the back of it. And that's where you really get your value from investment in learning and development. So I particularly call out to Andy Cope. I've sat through numerous workshops that he's delivered, and every time feel completely inspired and motivated by him. And I would say I live and breathe a lot of what he says inside and outside of work. Yeah. So I would say the Art of Brilliance.
Brilliant. We'll tag them in the notes for the podcast. Absolutely. Great. Well, I think we're nearing the end of our time. It's been great chatting. Any kind of final thoughts on anything that we've talked about?
So in a nutshell, I would say HR is around aligning the needs of the employee with the needs of the employer. That sounds easy. It isn't. However, for anyone that's thinking about whether HR is the right function for them, I absolutely love it. I think it's such a fantastic function. And I think if you want to make a difference and really influence, it's absolutely the right discipline. So yes, aligning those needs is difficult, but it's worthwhile. Very rewarding.
Brilliant. Well, Nimira, thank you so much. I know I've taken a while to persuade you to join me on the podcast, but it's been brilliant. I've really enjoyed chatting, and yeah, thank you again.
Thanks so much, Nic, for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the HRD Talks podcast. Hopefully you found the discussion helpful. If so, please follow us on your podcast provider to be notified of future episodes and share with friends and colleagues. For more information on the podcast, please visit actons.co.uk/the HRD Talks.